Hello, everybody, and welcome to this very special episode of Grey History. I'm your host, Will Clark, and this is the first ever joint episode with another podcast. In today's joint episode, I team up with Steve Guerra of the History of the Papacy podcast for a wide-ranging discussion on everything to do with both the Catholic Church and the papacy before, during, and after the French Revolution. Now, this is quite a lengthy episode. It's about an hour and a half, and so I've split this episode into three distinct parts. If you would like to listen to this episode in smaller, bite-sized chunks, the exact timing of these parts can be found in the show notes, or just listen out for the mini Grey History ad breaks. Those three parts are roughly as follows. Part 1 is more me interviewing Steve about the history of both the Church and the papacy, not only in France, but Europe more broadly. This is a broad conversation covering both medieval and early modern history. In part 2, we flip the script. It's more Steve interviewing me, discussing a wide range of topics regarding the role of the Church, the Pope, and regular priests in the French Revolution. This includes the initial, more cooperative relationship between some revolutionaries and clerics, all the way through to how the Catholic Church and the Revolution become the very definition of mortal enemies. We touch on everything from the nationalization of church property to what sorts of priests were more or less likely to swear loyalty to the new constitution. We also discuss the tensions that existed within the church during the Revolutionary era, as well as the de-Christianization campaigns which occurred during the Terror. In part 3, we change the approach once again. It's more of a two-way discussion in which Steve and I discuss how the Revolution impacted the papacy and the Catholic Church in the decades following the Revolution, and how these events helped to craft the modern Catholic Church and papacy that you and I know today. So please enjoy this fantastic joint episode between the History of the Papacy podcast and Grey History. You can find the History of the Papacy on all good podcast apps, and there's tons of material for you to sink your teeth into. As a reminder, I'm currently working on Grey History full-time, and this experiment is only possible thanks to the Patreon supporters of the show. I've left my job, I've moved homes, I'm doing everything I can to go that little bit further, to bring Grey History to you that little bit longer. But it won't be possible forever. It's just not sustainable. If you're enjoying Grey History, if you agree that history needs to be told in a way that embraces ambiguity and nuance, then I need your help to keep Grey History running. Help be the change you want to see, and support the podcast today. Welcome to Grey History. History of the Papacy joint episode.
So today we're talking about the French Revolution and kind of setting a little bit of the stage of what was going on with the papacy and the Catholic Church. I'm really happy and excited to talk with Will of Grey History. I'm loving the Grey History. I'm burning through episodes trying to get caught up.
Well, thank you for that, Steve. It's there's a little bit of a library to get there, and each episode gets a little longer, I think, as time goes on. So there's just a little bit more to do as you catch it up. I'm also enjoying. I'm jumping in and out of various episodes of the History of the Papacy podcast as well, and it's I've been listening to the Pontifex pod as well, so I feel like I'm knee deep in pontifical history at the moment, which I'm loving.
And it's exciting because papal history and Catholic Church history is so intertwined with French history and especially the French Revolution that it'll be really great for both of our audiences to get on the same page with what's going on with those two really important aspects of French history and European history.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things that you cannot talk about the French Revolution without talking about the history of the Catholic Church and the role that the Catholic Church and the papacy plays in how the revolution evolves. It's just so critical. And then likewise, you can't talk about, I mean, not only the history of the modern world, but in particular, you can't talk about modern church history and the position of the Pope now without looking at just how impactful the revolution was in terms of, really how we think of the Pope today, as opposed to maybe the powers and the position of the Pope in European society, pre-revolutionary times.
Yeah, absolutely. The Catholic Church in France goes back a long, long way. And really, it starts all the way back before there even was a France with the Franks. And there's Clovis, and you can go back and listen to episodes to get more details. But there's a lot of big names in pre-France, Franks, and then going into when there is more of a proper France. But then some of the big names are Martin of Tours, St. John Cassian, who's really the father of Western monasticism. He founded his monastery in southern modern day France. Catholic practice in France really took on its own flair or flavor, if you will. It had its own tweaks to the Mass, to the liturgy. It had its own version of their chant, etc. And that really wasn't unusual for the time. Visigothic Spain had its own, Anglo-Saxon England, Ireland, different parts of Italy, and the German states all took their own individual takes on certain aspects of the liturgy and all aspects of Christianity. And diversity of practice was not unusual. It's really a modern day, modern being maybe the last 200 years, that there was really an idea that there should be one practice that was really based on the Roman practice. I mean, you even go back to Augustine in the 400s, and he asks Ambrose of Milan, oh, they're not doing things right in this place. I think he was in Milan, or no, he was in Rome, and Augustine was accustomed to the practices of Milan, and Ambrose just tells him to take a break. That's where you do as the Romans. But a big, big theme in papal history from this point all the way back in the antiquity forward is that the popes are fighting to secure control over the papal states, which we'll get into in a minute, and exercise authority over Christendom, mostly the western part of Europe at this point, but also dipping their toe into the East in religious affairs. And those are the two really big themes that set the stage for all of the Middle Ages and really even all the way to the modern age.
Yeah, well, if you think about, the Pope pretty much, as a Prince of Rome as well, has long been in contest with the various powers and rulers, and then eventually, as we get to more state-like entities, as we move into the Middle Ages, he's just kind of continuously jostling for power, not only from a religious authority perspective, but also a secular authority perspective. And I think a lot of my listeners might be surprised at just how much temporal power the popes had, and also how involved in government affairs the church was, in terms of, if you look at how powerful some would say the bishops were in the Holy Roman Empire, call it 1,000 years ago, I think it would astonish a lot of people nowadays that weren't quite familiar with the power of the church then. And it might be worth maybe you jumping into some of the roles, the kind of responsibilities that nowadays we would consider to be part of a secular government, that the church was actually responsible for in this time. The various pies that the Pope and his his cardinals and bishops had their fingers in, so to speak.
Yeah, if you go back to antiquity, when the Roman Empire fell in the West, the church was really the only organization that was standing that could take care of the day-to-day things that the Roman Empire took care of. security to some degree. In a lot of places, the bishop was the only person around who could get the militia together on the walls. It's, all sorts of simple things like taking alms to the poor. The Catholic Church was almost the default fallback to what I say, taking out the garbage and just the general things that make a society run. There was these Germanic kings. They didn't have a lot of interest or even the organizational skill to take over these functions that the Roman Empire had left behind, and the church was the last man standing.
Well, and that makes sense. I mean, if you think about the position that they had from a spiritual and moral authority, it would have been easier for them to kind of take up that mantle, so to speak, that was left behind by some of the institutions of the Roman Empire.
Now, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, it takes a big turn in the 750s. Prior to that period, for about 250 years, the Byzantine, or the Eastern Roman Empire, had really dominated the papacy. The Byzantines controlled most of the Italian peninsula, and that started to shrink. But Rome was firmly under Byzantine control for a long time, up until the 700s. The popes of Rome were basically vassals of the Byzantine emperor or one of his designees. They couldn't be officially consecrated until they got the stamp of approval of the Byzantine emperor. All that really, evolutionarily, it was changing because the Byzantines were getting beaten back in Italy and their powers were shrinking into certain sections of the northern part of the peninsula and the southern part of the peninsula. After 752, Pope Zachary gave the nod to Pepin the Frank to take power officially in the Frankish court. The Pepin was kind of the de facto leader of France over the Merovingians, but he wanted de jure power, and the Pope helped with that. And in appreciation, Pepin donated a certain section of land that he had conquered in the Italian peninsula. What would eventually become the Papal States was given to the Pope as their own territory. So the Pope was the religious power there, but the Pope was also the secular leader of that little duchy or proto state, whatever you want to call it. The other thing that starts to develop is who was going to appoint bishops. And that was a major, major issue because, like you were saying, well, bishops had a vast amount of power. And in a lot of places, the bishop might actually be the secular leader as well as the religious leader. And they were just in control of vast amounts of wealth and land. Also, the up and coming monasteries, which the monastery was basically the economic engine of a lot of these areas. And who would be the one to appoint them? Obviously, both the popes thought that was a part of his religious power, and then with some side benefits of also controlling the economy. Whereas on the flip side, the secular leaders thought that, well, hey, this is a major economic part of my empire or my kingdom. And I get the side benefit of appointing the religious leader too. So you can definitely see where there's going to be a major point of contact there, or point of conflict there, I should say.
Absolutely. And then, I mean, I'm sure you'll get into this as it relates to the French church and the particular kind of prerogatives that the French kings insisted upon having in terms of nominating the bishops within their realms eventually. But you've got to remember to build on your point that, for those members of the audience that aren't necessarily as familiar with, how to think about this particular topic, is that when you're thinking about bishops, because they have so much control over economically valuable pieces of land and entire economies, entire towns and small urban communities, not only do they possess significant wealth, and we're in a time now where land means power and land means wealth far more than it does today. But it also means that bishops actually have small armies, or at least forces that they can contribute to a king. So when you see civil wars and civil strife, particularly in Europe, and I'm thinking at the moment in particular of the Holy Roman Empire, people will call upon bishops for the wealth that they can offer a particular campaign, but also the military forces as well. So, these positions of religious authority were really temporal leaders as well. They were the leaders of their own little duchies or bishoprics or states. Proto-state would be a better term for it. But they were much more of a ruler in everyday government affairs than we would think of bishops today. And then the two roles compared to how we think of a bishop today and how a bishop was, say, 1,000 years ago, are vastly different.
Yeah, I think that's really important to point out for sure. And just to jump off of that, and I'm sure both of us along the way will be using terms like Italy and France, England, Germany, but those places wouldn't exist for a long, long time. Germany was Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of duchies, and France was in the same situation. Spain, they're all a total patchwork of medieval fiefdoms, and that had all these different connections to each other, and they were not states as such. England was probably the only one that would really get something close to what we might think of as a modern state.
Well, the way I describe it is, particularly when you're thinking about the Holy Roman Empire, is that if you get if you kind of put down a map of modern day Europe and you got a glue stick, I don't know if that's what you call it in the States, but there's some glue, and you put it all over modern day Germany, a little bit of Switzerland, a little bit of Eastern France, Western Poland, Austria, etc. And then you pick up like a bucket of glitter and throw it at that map, and then pick up the map and shake it off a little bit, and then look at all this colorful little beautiful artwork that you've created. And if each one of those pieces of glitter was its own independent political entity, that's the Holy Roman Empire. And it's a slight exaggeration, but you're literally, you're talking about at times hundreds of little independent cities, independent towns, bishoprics, duchies, provinces. It's just chaotic, and that didn't exactly exist to the same extent in, say, France or Italy, but you did have a range of territories, larger duchies, provinces, etc. And in the case of France, what that resulted is, as the French state grew, it was inheriting all these independent political entities. So as they became part of the French state, they brought in all sorts of independent customs and traditions as well. So at this point in time, yes, when we're talking about France, and to your point, as we're talking about France and Italy and Germany, what we're really talking about is the political entities that were located in these modern states, but these modern states did not exist. In the case of Italy and Germany, they didn't exist as unified states until the 1800s.
Also, culturally, each one of these places there was a lot of bleeding through with culture, with language. You could go from one village to the next and get almost what you might, even though nominally they're speaking French or Italian or German, they're almost completely different languages. If you get a county or a duchy or a province a few away, and the thread that was really connecting all of these disparate places together was not a national identity. It was the idea that they're all Catholic, that the idea of Christendom was really people's identity over and above any proto-national idea.
Yeah, well, it's not. I mean, some historians make the point that it's not until the French Revolution that we start to see what we would consider to be modern day or modern nationalism. And to your point, even when the French Revolution commenced, the amount of non-French speakers, or the amount of even French speakers that, say, the average Parisian would have quite a fair bit of difficulty communicating with, was a significant proportion of the country. And you also just had people that just didn't speak French along the eastern border, for example. You'd have a lot of German speakers. So And that's actually part of why the church was so important, because one of the few ways that the old regime, and by that I mean the regime of kings that existed before the revolution, one of the few ways that they could actually get things done was by working with the church, because they would work with local priests and cures and bishops to disseminate royal edicts and royal proclamations. And that was one of the few ways that they could actually, govern a country, in the case of France, that was so non-homogenous in nature, in terms of its culture and in terms of its language.
And the whole idea of a lingua franca of Latin was a key way of administration to just tie all of these disparate things together. And it wouldn't be until, like you're saying, the French Revolution and the time after that, that countries are going to invent basically schooling systems to teach a standard dialect of French, Italian, English, and probably in a lot of reasons today, that's why you and I, even speaking English, can speak to each other. If things had been a little different, we might not have been able to, over the course of generations, even communicate with each other in English. We'd be speaking our own regional dialects, and we'd have to speak something like Latin or something together to be able to even communicate.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's probably a few people that think Australian slang is complicated enough, even with it. But yeah, it's one of those things that, I mean, you mentioned education. It's one of those things where the revolution actually took an awful lot of time focused on education and how to overhaul the education system in the creation of a modern French state. Now, unfortunately, the Revolutionary Wars kind of took precedence in terms of their focus and their attention, and so they didn't get to implement all their grand plans. But again, things like a standardized national language and a standardized national education system, they are quite modern ideas. And prior to that, it was the church that played a large role in education and communication across geographies that, to your point, might have had very little to do with each other except for their common faith, or at least until the Reformation, when their common faith became a little less common.
There's a couple more points I think that are worth bringing up just to get us all on the same page going into the late 18th century, and at least in the papal church part of this equation is the Avignon papacy, and then the suppression of the Templars. I mean, we're skipping a lot of things. We're skipping the Crusades, but I think these couple of key points will at least illuminate kind of what was going on. And with the Avignon papacy, that was basically a time where the French monarchs took over the papacy and the curia and the whole apparatus of the Catholic Church during most of the 1300s. Avignon is a city in southern France, and it's interesting because it's almost near where Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, I believe part of the papal enclave of Avignon, bordered the Holy Roman Empire, even though in today's terms, Avignon is pretty securely inside of France. I mean, that shows you how complicated that time period was. This whole Avignon papacy was a very ugly time in papal history. It's also the time of the Black Death. So there's a lot of pretty rough and tumble stuff going on there. During this time period, the popes were French and the cardinals were mostly French, and it was fairly much completely run by the French kings. All of this wouldn't end until the Council of Constance in 1418, where there was three popes at the time. There was a movement always to get things back to Rome. Of course, the French kind of liked what was going on with having it in Avignon, but there was a pope in Rome. I think there might have been two popes in Rome, and then there's the pope in Avignon. And basically, the Council of Constance said all of them got to go, and we're going to pick a new person. And it was probably what actually saved the papacy as an institution, because I mean, how long could it go on having three claimants? I mean, it was that can't go on forever. One thing that happened slightly before, but kind of at the same time as the transition to the Avignon papacy, was the suppression of the Templars. And the papacy was pretty on board with the Templars. And with the Templars, that's a whole its own can of worms, but it was basically the French kings were totally in hock to the Templars financially, and they wanted the Templars out of the way. The popes found that the Templars were still a pretty useful organization, but the popes wound up just caving entirely to what the French king wanted. There's also a rise of something called Gallicanism, which the French church, it was really the French church separating itself from the church in general. They were still in communion with Rome and with Spain and all the other Catholic churches, but they were really trying to emphasize the Frenchness of their church. Uh, Kind of like if anybody's familiar with the Eastern churches, the Church of Bulgaria, the Church of Russia, Constantinople, Romania, they're all independent of each other, but they're all kind of pulling in the same direction, you might say. The Gallican Church, they wanted to really be their own thing, with the Pope of Rome as sort of a titular first among equals, but the day-to-day operations were going to be all in-house inside of the French church, or the Gallican Church. Then we get the Protestant Reformation, and that's a major pinch on papal religious power, but really doesn't change anything going on inside of the papal state, the secular power. But then at the same time, when you have the power of the popes contracting in Europe, they lose basically half of the continent to the Protestant Reformation. There's a huge expansion of the Catholic Church in the New World, in North America, South America, in the East, the Far East of Asia. Then in the 1500s, there's a really big pushback by the Catholic Church of the Counter Reformation, and you get the rise of the Jesuits, who are really starting to push back on the Protestants. Then the one last thing, and that's the major part of the Counter Reformation, is the Council of Trent in the 1500s, and that's where we get the idea starting of a much more muscular papacy on religious terms and secular terms. And it won't always play out successfully, but it's the idea is starting to get set that the popes have this secular power in the papal states, but they also are supreme, or they should be supreme, amongst the Catholic Church. Now in France, you have the rise of the Huguenots, and then they really get pushed down with they're severely persecuted. A lot of them wind up going to North America and the colonies of the English colonies of North America, and that really leaves France doesn't get super affected by the Protestant Reformation, and it really does remain a Catholic state, but it's also influenced by the Protestants, in that they want some freedom from the papacy. And we'll kind of see how that plays out going into the French Revolution in the later part of the 18th century.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. So that if you think about the Reformation in France, yes, when France gets to the French Revolution, it's predominantly a Catholic country. About 97% of the population is nominally Catholic. But like many countries during that kind of Reformation period and immediately afterwards, there was quite a bit of religious and civil unrest as a result of the Reformation. And you've already mentioned the Huguenots there. Between in kind of the latter half of the 1500s, France experienced quite considerable amounts of civil war, or religious inspired civil war, because of the Protestant and Catholic churches, or members of their communities that had become either Protestant or had become Protestant instead of Catholic. And it's actually worth noting that 2 successive French kings were assassinated as a direct result of the religious tensions of those times. So Henry III and Henry IV. And so it was, even though France came through that period of time nominally quite a Catholic country, in part because of some of the reforms that Louis XIV introduced in the decades after that unrest, it didn't escape it entirely. And so while you don't have a situation like you say have in some of the states of the Holy Roman Empire, which had quite large Christian minorities, you do, France, was by no means immune to some of that unrest.
Yeah, it really that you make the point that France was about 97% Catholic, and there really was a spectrum where you have the Enlightenment coming up, where people are, as especially in certain quarters of the society, are starting to break away from religion. But then you have a core who are super Catholic, but even within that, they're starting to bifurcate into groups that are really pro-papal, but also groups that are really pro Gallican or for a national regional church. So even amongst the religious, you're getting splits.
Hello, everybody. This is a quick ad break for our sponsor. Joking, I don't have a sponsor. Well, that's not quite true. While transnational corporations are hardly interested in advertising on a small niche history podcast, there are dozens of people helping to keep Grey History on the air. Those people are the Patreon supporters of the show, and it's those people who you should thank for making joint episodes like this even possible. For as little as $2 a regular episode, you can join the Grey History community on Patreon and do your bit to sponsor the podcast. That's only half a cup of coffee, but it really does help me pay the bills and focus bringing you more Grey History more often. In addition to all the warm, fuzzy feelings you'll get for helping to sustain one of your favourite history podcasts, you'll also gain access to a whole bunch of exclusive content, bonus episodes, episode extras, and behind-the-scenes videos. Some tiers also gain early access to future episodes, the ability to feature in the show as a voiceover, and handwritten thank you cards. But the regular show and all the additional content I have planned is only possible if I can continue to work on Grey History. And that will only happen if more listeners of the show support the podcast on Patreon. So please, help keep Grey History on the air and support the show on Patreon today. There's links in the show notes and on the website, or you can just Google Grey History Patreon. Patreon. Let's get back to the show with part 2 on the Catholic Church and Revolutionary France.
What's going on in France? What gets us to this revolution? Why is France going to have really? A lot of people will say the modern period starts 100, 200 years later, but in a lot of ways, we're getting modern right now in the French Revolution.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with what the church is looking like at this point in time, and then build out into what's happening more broadly in French society. So to pick up on the point that you were just talking about, the French church or the church within France on the eve of the revolution was incredibly divided. When we talk about the French Revolution and French society, we generally use the term the three estates. And that's because every member of society belonged to one of these estates. And you can think of them, they're not quite like classes, they're a bit more like castes. And essentially, the first estate was members of the church, the second estate were members of the nobility, and the third estate was everyone else, or the commoners. And so the vast majority of the population sat within the third estate. But if you look at those three estates, they all had their own internal tensions and internal divisions. But you could definitely make the argument that it was the first estate, it was the church, that was the most divided. And if you start to have a look at the situation with the church, it's just an absolute mess of competing interests and priorities. And so, and this is very important to understand how the revolution really kicks off, because at key points in time, it will be the church, or in particular, members of the church who were originally commoners, that will push the kind of their weight in favor of the commoners or the third estate, and really energize the revolution at particular points in time. Now, there's a range of reasons why the church was seeing a whole bunch of tension. You were mentioning that there were some that were more in the spirit of the Gallican church, where they wanted a kind of separate but equal status for the church alongside the Pope. They wanted to be in communion with the Pope, but they didn't want the Pope to be intervening in French affairs. You also had tensions between the lower clergy, so people that originally came from, say, the middle class backgrounds, or those from the higher clergy, the kind of higher bishops and archbishops, who were almost always aristocrats originally. And so, to give you a taste of what some of this looked like, if you take the Archbishop of Strasbourg, for example, he had a yearly stipend of 450,000 livres per year. A priest would earn about 750, which is a 600 times difference. You then overlay onto that the church is not meant to be a profit-making corporation, but is actually meant to be providing charitable means, poor relief, hospitals, moral and spiritual guidance. And the misuse or the extravagancies of the higher clergy create a lot of resentment and tension between them and members of the lower clergy, who in some cases, particularly if they were in the countryside, might live very, very modest lives. And so the church was really just this can of contradictions immediately prior to the revolution. If we take a step back and then go, well, what about church within French society immediately prior to the revolution? As I said before, nominally, 97% of the country was Catholic. The church also only being about 0.5% of the French population, owned about 10% of French property, French land. And if you think about land in these times, land and wealth are synonymous. They're joined at the hip, much more than they are today, where most of the richest people in the world have made their money through means other than real estate and direct land enrichment. So the church was in this great position, but if you then scratch under the surface, to your point around things like the Enlightenment and the like, it wasn't necessarily as strong as it might look. 2 years prior to the revolution in 1787, there was toleration granted for Protestants, which was seen as a real blow to French Catholics who believed that they should have a monopoly on religion within the state. You also have evidence of waning kind of adherence to orthodox views. So, for example, in the century prior to the revolution, the number of pregnant brides almost doubles in number. The number of priests actually almost declines by half. So there's a range of facts that you can look at and go, well, yes, the country is nominally 97% Catholic, but only half of Parisians were taking communion on a regular basis. So just how Catholic France was is a bit of a matter of debate. It's not quite clear. The one thing I would say to that, however, is that particular communities, it very much changed on a regional level. And so you at this point in time, only 1 in 5 Frenchmen would have lived in a community of more than 2,000 people. It is primarily a rural state. If you think about that, the average citizen probably lived in a community of somewhere between 600 to 800 people. If you live in a city and you get on a packed train in the morning, your train could be your entire community that you were living in at this time. So what that meant is that particular communities were still very much true believers, and their priests and bishops played a huge role in their everyday lives. Now, if I take all the step back and go, okay, well, what's this revolution and where are we? Where are we? After the American Revolutionary War, the French participated in that war, and essentially that and other conflicts bankrupted the French state. And the state needed to raise tax revenues because they could not meet their budget deficit as well as service their existing loans. And to do that, they needed to start taxing the first and second estate. They needed to start taxing the church as well as the aristocrats, who by and large got out of paying any sort of tax burden. It's a little complicated, but by and large, they got out of it. And so the aristocrats and members of the church, unsurprisingly, said, no, we don't want to pay any taxes, and tried to use it to their advantage. And in many ways, the French Revolution actually starts a bit more as an aristocratic revolt than anything else. However, as those groups are arguing for political power, the commoners, the third estate, take advantage of a range of things, including reduced censorship, Enlightenment ideas, and also powered on by high costs of living and high bread prices and the hardships that those produce, to essentially create a more general revolutionary and revolt-like environment. The royal government is forced to call an advisory body, a traditional advisory body called the Estates General, which hadn't met in almost 200 years. The royal government was quite against doing that because they felt like if they called the Estates General, that would be a nod towards the kind of constitutional monarchy that Great Britain or England at this point in time had. But they had to do so anyway, and sure enough, as the nightmare of the royalists came true, and that advisory body known as the Estates General proceeded to go rogue and unilaterally declare itself the National Assembly and place upon itself powers akin to something like a parliament or a congress, as well as a constitutional convention. And it is worth noting, just before I wrap up there, that at key points in time in the deadlock between the Estates General and members of the government, it was members of the church, particularly the lower clergy, that actually backed the commoners and broke the deadlock in their favor. And so we see initially, although the revolution and the church end up being arch enemies, and you get essentially what is a holy war, you get a de-Christianization campaign, you get a prisoner pope, it's a complete mess. But initially in 1789, you actually get many prominent revolutionaries coming from the lower clergy. And initially, the church, or at least some members of the church and the Third Estate, not only don't have a hostile attitude towards each other, but are actually working in a cooperative manner.
Yeah, you bring up so many interesting issues, and I think one of them is, and that I didn't fully understand, was how split each of these estates was. That the third estate, there were bourgeois who were, even though they were technically third estate people, they were pretty wealthy. But then you also had peasants who were completely poor. But even amongst the aristocracy, you had dirt poor aristocrats, and then obviously super wealthy. And then inside of the church, you have these fabulously wealthy bishops kind of in the middle of that, priests and bishops. And then, your town bishop, or town priest rather, who was dirt poor. And it creates all sorts of different politics. Like, you could honestly see why a poor town priest, or maybe a bishop of kind of a backwater place, might want a connection to somebody like the Pope, because the Pope can be somebody to play off of this bigger bishop. I'm not really, I have to answer to my archbishop in Strasbourg or Paris or something. But come on, guys, let's be honest. The Pope's really the big guy here, and the Pope should be telling you what to do to try and help me out a little bit.
Well, and indeed, one of the great things about the French Revolution is just before that Estates General, that advisory body, was summoned by the king, all the estates were asked to draft up what in English we call lists of grievances. So each community, each little kind of parish around the country, and then within that, the members of the clergy, the members of the nobility, and the members of the commoners separately drafted up a list of grievances. And so we have thousands of documents knowing what the chief grievances and the chief problems of communities are all across France before what is one of, if not the greatest revolution in modern times. And you can see within those lists of grievances for the church that each individual community has just got its own priorities and its own problems that it's trying to solve. And, the rhyme or reason between them, between geographies can be so incredibly diverse. But one of the themes that you pick up on, there are some common complaints. And one of them, for example, is absentee bishops. So you'll see priests complaining that their bishop or their archbishop has essentially been installed into that diocese, and then has gone off to the court in Versailles and is essentially living the high life, maybe gambling, maybe drinking a little too much, and is absent from the community that they're meant to be looking after. And so that's, to your point, that's where someone like the Pope or the King would be great to be able to call upon and, ensure bishops of merit and ensure that they weren't absentee. And in fact, some of the reforms that the revolutionaries will force upon the church will focus on some of these common grievances.
Maybe it's a little bit of a break before we jump into the revolution proper. When you're doing your research, do you see a difference? I don't know how much, and I don't think I've gotten to the point where you talk about your sources in specific, but do you get into French sources? Do they have maybe a different spin on it than maybe the French Revolution than what we might get in reading the sources through an English eye, you might say?
So I suppose there's two ways to answer that question. So first of all, I would say a significant number of the sources that I use were originally from French historians or French writers or French eyewitnesses that have been translated into English, which helps give you a different perspective. Although, of course, you can in the process of translation, kind of change the subtleties and nuances of what the text is trying to convey originally. In terms of the kind of raw French text, I don't speak French, so kind of there is definitely times when I'll see a footnote in an English text, for example, that's referencing a French text, and I really want to understand what that it's maybe a few sentences, and I actually want to try to figure out what's the page or the chapter that source is referencing. In which case, you can kind of reach out to members of the community or the supporters of the show, French speakers that and get them to help translate a larger piece of work, a few pages or the like, so that you can get a better sense of that fact or that quote or whatever it might be that you saw in an English text. But as someone who's not a French speaker, I am limited in that. So the best that I can do is to make sure that there are French historians and French eyewitnesses that I'm reading, in addition to, historians from other countries. And also a big thing of what I try to do is you're trying to not only read material from contemporaries and eyewitnesses, both inside of France and outside of France at the time, but also in the decades and centuries afterwards. And so, if in my show, I put a premium on bringing in the opinions of historians and contemporaries and eyewitnesses. Some people that you are hearing from, you might hear from someone who has published their work in 2015, and that is then, being compared to or being built upon by someone who has published their work in, 1847. It really varies. There's no shortage of materials on the French Revolution, which means there's a lot of reading to do, but it's also you get quite a good view of the thing.
Initially, the French Revolution really seems to parallel the American Revolution, but then they really greatly diverge. What's happening in the French Revolution?
Yeah, so I suppose so. Absolutely, they initially seem to have much greater parallels, and in fact, initially just after the revolution commences, the Marquis de Lafayette, who plays quite a prominent role in the American Revolution. He's a member of the Estates General, which transforms into the National Assembly, and he actually introduced a document, the Declarations of Rights of Men, that he, was very much modeled on the American model. But for a variety of reasons, the revolutionaries do not follow the American model. So, for example, they decline to introduce a Senate. They will only have a one chamber in their national legislature. But in terms of why the two diverge so much, I mean, that's a complicated question. But in a quick answer, one big thing is that the revolution, you're dealing with a much older country with very powerful, very wealthy institutions, being the church and the aristocracy, and you're dealing with a nation that is literally surrounded by enemies. Now, yes, the English and the Spanish were maybe not the most menacing for the revolution, but in particular, the Austrians, the Prussians, the Holy Roman Empire, the Papacy. The revolution really does feel that it's in a corner against entrenched counter-revolutionary aristocratic eventually papal interest. And so that creates a culture of fear and conspiracy that you just don't get in the American Revolution. And that drives the revolutionaries towards war. It will actually be the French that creates or so that starts the Revolutionary Wars in 1792. And it's the Revolutionary / Napoleonic Wars that gripped the continent for a quarter of a century. And so that's one big thing. You're dealing with a country that has, institutionalized wealthy opposition to the reforms that are being introduced, and can call upon, or at least they think they can call upon, foreign armies to literally, kill the baby in the crib, so to speak. And so that is a big factor as to why you have a very different culture of the revolutionary conscious than you do in the American Revolution, amongst other reasons. But that would be one of the obvious things to point to.
Yeah, one thing that I was thinking is maybe the American Revolution would have gone in a French Revolution if certain things like Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, the more populist aspects, where the American third estate, you could almost call them, if they had pushed some of these issues and the central government had lost control of them, and the proper government, the states governments, had really lost control, then you might have seen things really go down a very different path of maybe a more French revolutionary path.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the American Revolution, but one thing that while you were talking that did come to mind is you do have in the French Revolution in particular, Paris is just this giant metropolis for the times. So, we're dealing with a country at this point in time that is about 26 million people. There's only 8 towns or regional centers that are above 50,000 people in size. And Paris is sitting at maybe, call it 700,000. So it is this huge metropolis. And so that gives the heart of the revolution immense power. And you don't quite have, well, you just don't have the states in the American Revolution, which which are already thinking of themselves as political entities that are joining together. That idea doesn't really exist in France. The old regime, the regime prior to the revolution, had incredibly centralizing tendencies. There was some decentralization initially when the revolution started to get going, but then once the war kicked in and necessity kicked in, it became incredibly centralized again. So you're just dealing with a situation where, for a variety of reasons, the country just was not, it was a much bigger country with a much longer and complicated history, which, combined with the challenges it faced, was quite different. Even though some of the inspirational ideas for the revolution were similar to the American Revolution, the challenges and the situation it found itself in was actually probably more different than most people might think.
Where did the revolution go? How did it, in short as we can, as an overview, go after this point of when it starts to go down the road of more violence and more? It's definitely not going to just be a mild reforms. It's going all in.
Yeah, so it's actually the revolution's conflict with the church actually has a decent a decent impact on why the revolution morphs into the revolution that it does. So maybe I'll just start with how the relationship with the church soured, and then use that to springboard more broadly. So initially, as I said, the kind of all-consuming conflict between the revolution and the Catholic Church and the papacy just didn't exist. There were many prominent revolutionaries in the National Assembly, at least initially, that came from the church. However, as the National Assembly started to reform the country, and with the old regime, you're dealing with a very archaic and outdated and just illogical system of government that they were trying to standardize and rationalize. They inevitably started to want to reform the church. And one of the first things that they did, which really created, a fair bit of tension, but wasn't an irreversible split, was they nationalized church property. So the church owned 10% of French land, and depending on the community, they might even own a greater proportion of that land. So they owned almost 25% of the property in Paris, for example. And as I mentioned earlier, the key reason why we get the French Revolution in the form that we do is that the state was facing bankruptcy. They had a financial crisis where they could not pay their bills. And so the revolutionaries looked over to the church with this huge amount of wealth and huge amount of land and pretty much said to themselves, well, we've got a use for that. And so what the revolutionaries did is that they forcibly nationalized church property. And the logic that they used for this was essentially that the reason why the church was so wealthy was that over the centuries, French nationals, French citizens, had donated property to the church, and the church was meant to use that property to provide things like poor relief, to sponsor hospitals, to sponsor poorhouses, to provide education, and also to do things that we would nowadays associate with a secular government, such as maintain, the registers for births and deaths and marriage. And so the new national government, the National Assembly, pretty much said, well, what we'll do is we'll partly take responsible for some of those things. We will start to pay the priests out of the national budget. They will essentially become salaried employees of the state. And as a result, because we're paying the priests and because this land was originally donated to the church for the benefit of the French nation, well, the French nation needs it. And so the way it's going to benefit the French nation is the government essentially seizing it and then selling it off to meet their budgetary demands. Now, initially, this did not create an irreversible split with the church. There were some members of the church that were actually supportive of this. They thought that this would remove some of the corruption of the church, some of the opulence of the church, return the church to its more traditional priorities of preaching and being moral and spiritual guidance and not being caught up in the trappings of wealth. But of course, the vast majority of the church and of course the Pope were dead against this. But then what we have over, the revolution really kicks off in mid 1789. The nationalization of church property happens towards the end of 1789. But it's in the middle of the next year that things really just go haywire, really. And that's with a policy that's called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. And this policy was seeking to do a range of things, but essentially what it was seeking to do was reform the Catholic Church so that it could be a church that would act in harmony with the new constitutional monarchy and also be separate but potentially equal to the papacy. And so it was seeking to modernize the church. And so what it was seeking to do was introduce a whole bunch of things that some of those lists of grievances had demanded. So, for example, it started to crack down on absentee bishops, and it sought to make bishops and priests be nominated by merit. And so the way that it wanted to do this was actually to introduce elections. I mean, one of the big things about the French Revolution is the introduction of democratic values and eventually universal male suffrage. And so what they wanted to do was introduce elections for priests and for bishops. And the argument was, well, these individuals are now salaried employees of the state. And so therefore, like every other salaried employee of the state, they should be elected. Now, the problem here, there was a few problems here, but one of the key problems here was that meant that any French citizen could participate in these elections, which meant that Protestants, atheists, people of other religions could potentially participate in these elections. It also meant that some of the most passionate believers in the Catholic faith, in particular women, so half the congregation, were not allowed to vote in these elections. So that was one thing that the Civil Constitution did. Another thing was that it tried to standardize the various parishes and dioceses of the country, which resulted in a significant amount of changes. It was trying to standardize things, reduce like the overlap and duplication. But what that meant in that some communities is that their local parish church would have to close down because they were running on the assumption that you'd only have one parish church for every 6,000 people. In a city like Paris, for example, which had 52 parish churches, it would lose or parishes, it would lose 19 of its parishes. So there was a significant amount of closure of religious buildings and the like as a result of these reforms. And then finally, the main thing that they did, and you'll be able to talk about just how infuriating this would be to a papacy that saw itself as being more muscular, is that they essentially banned bishops from being able to bring in the Pope in any dispute. The king and the French Church were completely, were functionally separate from the Roman Catholic Church and the Prince of Rome. They could inform the Pope about what they were up to, but literally that was the extent of what they could do. They weren't allowed to appeal to the Pope to adjudicate on anything, and the Pope was not allowed to get involved in matters of the French Church. They wanted to create a separate entity, and you can imagine just how intolerable that was to the Pope. Now, where this started to really go wrong is that some of the bishops and priests pretty much said that they weren't willing to sign up to this. They weren't willing to have their parish closed. They weren't willing to have Protestants help to elect Catholic priests. And so they started to refuse to comply with the wills of the government. And the government, believing that this really was an administration issue that the church had no right to oppose, and in fact viewed the church as corrupt in some regards, and therefore, of course they were going to resist it, essentially started forcing it through. And eventually they required all priests to take an oath of allegiance to the law and to the country and to the constitution. And about half of the priests across France refused to do so, particularly by the time that the Pope came out and publicly condemned these reforms. And so that then created, what was essentially a schism between the revolution and the church, where you had half the priests of the country willing to swear an oath of loyalty and allegiance to the constitution, and the other half not willing to. And so we call this second group of priests refractory clergy, or non-constitutional clergy, or non-juring clergy. And essentially, they refused to move. They refused to leave their churches. They refused to leave their parishes, and they insisted on continuing to preach, but they did so without the authority of the government. And they would often heckle and intervene and harass those priests who we call constitutional or patriotic priests that did take the oath and were subsequently elected into office. And so all across the country, in every city, in every town, in every small rural community, you start to get this battle between constitutional priests who took an oath to the Constitution and non-constitutional priests who have followed the Pope and who are refusing to obey these new rules. The parts of the country, it very much differs on how this looks like. So in some parts of the country, the proportion of priests that swear the oath versus not swear the oath, maybe you have 80% versus 20%. And in other parts of the country, it might be a more even 50-50 split. There's a whole bunch of analysis about things that might have driven this behavior. So for example, priests that were less financially secure, older priests, were more likely to take the oath because then they could get their salary from the federal government. Those priests that were, say, lived in towns and were surrounded by other priests and not as isolated were more likely to reject the oath. Likewise, priests that had aristocratic backgrounds or more wealthy backgrounds were more likely to reject the oath, while those that were from, say, the lower middle class that really valued the education that they might receive in the church were more likely to take it. So geographically, it's this real hodgepodge where some regions you might get 90% swearing the oath, and in other regions you might get 90% refusing to do so.
I mean, that's really fascinating, and it shows you how diverse it was.
Oh, it's
divisive.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's the thing about the French Revolution is that you just cannot talk about France as one entity, because at a regional level, it's just so different and so unique. Now, to get to your question of why did this start going, why did the revolution start souring? Well, as the revolution became more and more obsessed with the danger of counter-revolution, of nobles, of aristocrats who particularly had left the country and were now walking around Europe trying to rally Prussian and German and Italian armies to invade and crush the revolution, the revolutionaries, the patriots within France, started to become more and more worried about fifth column elements, about traitors within, about seditious plots. And you've got these priests, literally tens of thousands of priests across the country that are getting up in churches that, that they, from the government's point of view, shouldn't be in, and are preaching essentially that the people should ignore the federal government. And worse still, they are preaching the authority of the Pope. They are maybe preaching various things that collide with the official line from Paris. And so over time, these priests start to be viewed as enemies of the revolution. And so then when you get into a situation where France finds itself at war, that war actually starts quite terribly, and then France starts to get invaded, it doesn't take much to see how these priests go from a nuisance to actually a seditious element that is undermining the war effort and undermining the revolution and in cahoots with the Pope and other aristocrats and their objective to crush the revolution and to bring back the old regime. And so from there, you can see how the government starts passing laws about banishing priests, forcibly detaining priests, and removing them from French territory. And so you can start to see how the snowball starts rolling down the hill. And before long, particularly when the Prussian army is almost at the gates of Paris, these priests, which number half the priests in France, are viewed as enemies of the people. And so that, in conjunction with the war, is really what really radicalizes the revolution. In addition to things like high cost of living, high bread prices, high, the raw necessities of life being quite unobtainable, you get a very radicalized situation, which then leads to quite bloody situations. And ultimately results in a semi-state sponsored de-Christianization campaign. Hello, everybody. This is a quick reminder that I need your help, not someone else's, but yours, to keep Grey History running. Patreon supporters of the show gain an ad-free feed, so no mid-episode interruptions like this one. They also gain access to almost half a dozen bonus episodes, along with all the episode extras that accompany the regular show. You're not going to want to miss the episode extra on the Battle of Valmy for the upcoming episode on the invasion of France. So support the show today by becoming a Patreon supporter. You can cancel anytime. For as little as $2 a regular episode, you can help keep Grey History on the air.
You really do see how things could turn so quickly. The government sees that you have this wealthy church. Well, let's nationalize it and use that money for our own purposes. But you only get one bite of that apple. And once you burn through that, then you've got to move on to the next thing. And you can see when the populations throughout history get very grumpy when the percentage of their budget that's devoted to food starts to creep up, and then it just explodes. That's when you really see things start to fall apart. I mean, that's inflation.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because all these things are playing off each other, right? So, for example, the government starts seizing church property, and starts either selling it off or essentially issuing what is in effect bonds against the properties that they now control. But they start issuing this land and selling off this paper currency at such speed to meet their own needs that starts to create an inflationary environment. Furthermore, this paper currency, which is backed by the revolution, is absolutely worthless if the aristocrats or the counter-revolution successfully overturns the revolution. So you've got this real risk that the paper money that you've just been given might be worthless in a few months' time if the counter-revolution succeeds. And so what you end up with inflationary environment. And then combined into that, for example, say shortages that are produced by the war effort, where the army is forcibly requisitioning carts for the war effort, but then those carts can't be used to transport grain. And all of a sudden, you've got a whole host of factors which are driving up the cost of bread. And that then creates an even more radical and energized situation in the capital, which are being told by some members of the press that the reason why grain prices are so high is because the priests are hoarding the grain and destroying the grain. When in reality, that wasn't the case. But all these factors play into each other in a way that is impossible to see at the time, and it's only in the kind of in hindsight with all the facts that you can kind of pin it together. And inflation, was a hot button issue in the French Revolution. And it's nice to see, at the moment, inflation, I think, is on everybody's lips. Having spent the last 2.5 years subtly putting inflation jokes in the podcast, it's nice that, everyone wants to talk about it.
Yeah, you're right. You were ahead of the curve on that. Now, I think it's interesting too that once this inflation kicks in, and it's something that governments, maybe we're getting a little controversial with economics, but I think history bears this out. Is once inflation gets kicked off, it's easy to get started, but it's very difficult to get under control.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, you see that within the French Revolution itself, the paper currency that the government introduced essentially, it does not hold its worth, and it wildly fluctuates and creates all sorts of hardship. I mean, more broadly, inflation, it's a beast that is best tamed. And I mean, it will be fascinating to see, how things play out. I mean, it's not something, I'm from I suppose one of the younger generations. So inflation is not something that my generation has seen before. So, I'm obviously, from the perspective of me that wants to pay my bills, I want it to go away as soon as possible. From the inner historian part of me, I'm kind of curious as to just how this will work in the monetary environment that we have at the moment. And my background's actually finance, and I'm kind of fascinated to see how central bank action's going to change. But we're well and truly veering off the French Revolution at this point.
One thing that I think plays into what you were talking about is that there was a couple of things going on. Is one is that the popes of the 17th and 18th century, they were not they were pretty secure in their power in the papal states, but they weren't very muscular, really pushing their broader religious power in the rest of Europe. They just weren't it was just a string of not the strongest popes you've ever seen. And that's what really gets us into the French Revolution, is that you don't have popes with popes like Pius the Sixth. He just doesn't have much backbone to push back against what was going on in revolutionary France. But there are some other churchmen, theologians, who are really putting forward this idea of an ultramontane church. Ultramontane meaning the other side of the mountains, being that the religious focus should be all in Rome. But in the time leading up in the late 18th century, there's a lot of different regional movements, Gallicanism in France for one, but there's Jansenism, Febronianism, Josephism. Some of those are more focused in Austria, Hungary. Some of them are in Germany, but they're all different isms that are saying that now the Pope should have less power. But on the other side, you have different theologians who are saying, no, 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 no. The Pope needs to have not just more power religiously, the Pope needs to have all the power.
Yeah, well, it's to mention some of those isms that are occurring in other European states. Some of the reforms that I was just talking about nationalizing property and enforcing reforms upon the local Catholic Church. The Austrians were actually doing something quite similar to that immediately prior to the French Revolution, with Joseph II, and I mean his predecessor. And his brother Leopold II will be in charge when the revolution really starts to kick off. And so Leopold, who's generally referred to as one of the more enlightened monarchs of Europe, he's actually one of the first people to abolish the death penalty. That's one of his claims to fame. He is looking over at what the French are up to, and there's got to be part of him that's actually sympathetic to what they're trying to do. And so, to your point, the papacy was in this really odd position where, it's not like it has an army that it can call upon. It's really, though it has temporal authority in the papal states, realistically, it's a religious authority that it has to call upon. But it's got no choice but to really fight the reforms of the church, because they threaten the Pope's authority and power to such a great degree. I mean, for the French to essentially say that no members of the French church can appeal to the Pope for him to adjudicate on particular issues, you're essentially relegating the Pope to, just this guy that sits down in Rome and maybe occasionally comes up and gives a great ceremony at Easter. And so the papacy was really given no choice but to, I mean, if it was to protect its own interest, was really given no choice but to fight these reforms. And of course, members of the aristocracy, including the members of the royal family and brothers of the king, were they're more than happy to try to use the Pope to legitimize their efforts to overturn the revolution. But maybe that's something that you can expand upon further, about how the revolution kind of kicked off, a series of events that kind of, further relegated the Pope just to someone who had, spiritual authority, but realistically, couldn't command the kind of temporal authority that maybe, popes of a few hundred years prior could.
Yeah, I think that this is a really good time to introduce Pius the Sixth. He is, kind of the standard pope of the time, not super interested in really pushing any of the agenda of the papacy. He's pretty happy as the secular leader of the papal states. But the big thing is that the when the French Revolution gets going, they went into Italy and actually toppled the papal states, and Napoleon institutes and starts this Roman Republic. Napoleon arrested the Pope and brought him back to France, and it's absolutely humiliates Pius. Pius actually died in France, and they put him in the register of his birth name, not Pius. It was his last name was Broski, and they just put in the register Broski, and his job was listed as pontiff or pope. That really could have been the end of the papacy right there. But the only thing that the papacy had going for it really was that it was this transnational organization, and they were able to set up another conclave under Austrian auspices that were able to get another pope elected. But we look at this time period, just to get my dates, it's 1799, that the papacy could have ended right there, but it was able to get onto life support. And it's really a papacy on life support for a while that keeps things going. And it's not until the later, the earlier part of the 19th century that the Pope's able to gain some traction and start fighting back against this secularizing. They'll try as hard as they might to keep the secular authority of the papacy. But what they really do well is push out all of these national movements, all of these things like Gallicanism and Josephism, and just completely stamp those out. And that's the ultimate ascendancy, is that you have a papacy that's almost dead in 1799 to a papacy about 70 years later that is in complete control of the entire Catholic Church. It's absolutely supreme. And that's something that you would say you would never, somebody standing in the Middle Ages would have never conceived of a papacy that was absolutely supreme in all religious matters.
It's fascinating. And at that point in time, this is, the years, 5, 10 years either side of the dates that you're talking. This is when some very long-standing institutions and some very long-standing norms are being completely and utterly torn to the ground by both the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic Empire. I mean, it's at this point in time that the Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for, call it 1,000 years, is essentially dissolved. And so you're dealing with institutions and traditions that are being overthrown and toppled all over the place, and not institutions or traditions that have existed for a couple of years or a couple of decades, but literally things that have been around for centuries. And to your point, the papacy is really shaken to its absolute core, is in survival mode, really. And it is fascinating, to your point, that not only does it survive, but it really comes to thrive in the decades that follow the end of the Napoleonic era, and into the middle of the 19th century.
I wonder what you think of that too, because in my mind, we're almost living in the alternate reality. And I think it's so unusual and such almost a black swan, you might call it, that it fights against the entire current of what was happening, of the Pope gaining all the religious authority, when it really seems like the whole idea of the Enlightenment is exactly what was happening with Gallicanism and Josephism, Febronianism, all the various isms of separating church from state, and then having the church, having all these institutions be more nationalized.
I think in some ways the separation of church and state probably helps the church a little bit. It lets it focus on a core mission, which is that it's going to be a religious and moral and spiritual authority, and it's not going to compete in a power struggle with secular governments over things that nowadays we would consider to be the responsibility of secular governments. So I think in some ways it's probably helped by that. In the ways of, like, say, the regional tensions, I think you've got to remember that in the experience of France in particular, as well as some countries, or nowadays countries that were occupied by French forces, Belgium comes to mind, the experience that Catholics had in those regions was traumatic. The de-Christianization campaign that you see in 1793 and 1794 is referred to by some historians as a genocide against Catholic. It is, you get to a point in time where essentially there is no mass being said in France. Where churches across the country are closed down and vandalized and stripped of all their wealth. And this is an incredibly traumatic period of time for French Catholics, as well as other Catholics that were occupied under particularly revolutionary forces in that 1793-94 period. It's one of the reasons why the French have so much trouble in Belgium, is that the locals there are insistent on keeping the prominent position and power of their priests. And so I think after, such a traumatic experience, you start to, the differences of the past and the quarrels of yesterday might pale in comparison, and you're willing to start things afresh, so to speak. So I suspect that might have played a part as well, of members of the Catholic Church, coming to terms with the fact that their internal differences are probably nothing in comparison to what some secular governments, could do. And the one thing I would point out, because it would be remiss of me not to, is that, the de-Christianization campaign that you see in 1793 and 94, I mean, it's quite controversial and quite multifaceted, but it is not something that occurs with the full sponsorship of the national government in Paris. In many ways, most historians would argue that it's kind of a spontaneous event that occurs because of particular individuals at more regional levels that are quite anti-clerical or atheist, or fanatic in their belief. And in fact, some of the most famous revolutionaries at this point in time, some that have quite divisive reputations, like Robespierre, for example, are actually staunchly against the de-Christianization campaign. They view it as a foreign plot to undermine French unity, and the national government does pass laws in favor of freedom of worship and freedom of religion at a time when this is going on. So it's not it's quite a multifaceted and complicated topic, and I definitely don't want to give the impression that that campaign was wholeheartedly supported by the government in Paris, because that's not the case at all.
It really does seem, though, that all of these events are really the thing that helped disentwine or unravel religion from the state. And that was the room that allowed Catholicism to become its own thing and really connect back to Rome and not have to worry so much about Gallicanism and being the state church.
I suspect as much. I mean, it's not it's definitely we're veering out of something that is, is my repertoire. But I mean, ultimately, if you look at if such a bureaucratic and old institution such as the church and other old and bureaucratic institutions, sometimes the house kind of needs to burn down before you can rebuild it in a way that maybe makes more sense. And you look at the various theological and political, just sheer raw political and monetary squabbles that the church could get itself into from time to time. I think it needed something like the Revolution and the Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras to really shake it to its core and focus it back on, well, what are its key priorities? What are the things that it can reasonably do, given the fact that the rise of secular and national governments, and focus on those core things.
And internationally, there was a lot going on that strengthened a centralized church. The Catholicism becoming more prominent in England, with both within the Episcopalians, who are the Anglicans, who were becoming more Catholic, and some of them even becoming Catholic, with Irish coming into both the United States and Britain, England more so, and giving more of a Catholic flavor to what was going on in Great Britain at the time in these traditionally Protestant countries. And then Catholicism being separated from the state in a lot of other places, like even places that were as rock hard and rock ribbed Catholic as Portugal and Spain and Austria. It gave the church room to grow into its new role. So I think in a lot of ways that the house got burned down, or in the modern speak of it, it was a disruptor event with the French Revolution that allowed these different changes to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a phoenix from the fire moment, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy. Now I'm wondering, with your podcast, you'll get to the French Revolution. I mean, that's something that you could take for the rest of your life and more. But your show is gray history. Are you going to maybe go into some other areas where there's gray in the history, or are you going to maybe carry into France is not done with revolutions by a long shot?
Yeah, I mean, I'm only just kind of hitting the first republic, and the France is on its fifth republic at the moment. No, for those that aren't familiar with the show's called Grey History, grey like the color, and the premise of the show is that history isn't black and white. There's ambiguity, there's nuance, and it's in that ambiguity, it's in that grey, that history not only has really its intrigue and its beauty, but most importantly, its lesson. And I think that we, particularly in the Western world, could learn a lot, not only from the lessons of the past, but also use history as a medium to kind of see how two or three or four well-meaning people can have different perspectives on complicated issues and not be, sinister or evil. And so the French Revolution was a great starting point, because it's an event that no one can agree on really anything about it. Like, why it started, how it developed, how it ended. There's just nothing that anyone agrees with the French Revolution. So, the purpose of the show is to go through the revolution in a somewhat sequential manner, and take the time to compare and contrast differing eyewitness perspectives, different perspectives and conclusions from historians. And so that's why, the episodes, they're generally quite lengthy in nature, and we're moving through the revolution, at a reasonable pace, but it's certainly not at a quick pace. Eventually, to answer your question, I'd like to do other topics. There's a range of thorny issues that I would really love to unpack and spend the time on the gray, whether that's the Vietnam War or the American Civil War, other revolutions, some of the say the British British colonial India. I think there's a range of topics that people would find really interesting, especially if you take the time to compare and contrast what can be quite divisive issues in perspective.
Yeah, I think that you really get to a great point there in the West is that there's so much either good guys and bad guys, the black hats and the white hats, and it's becoming more and more difficult for people to say, well, there's individual actors and they have their own motivations, and their motivations aren't always exactly clear. I mean, even in what we're discussing now, of with the papacy and the French government, there were a lot of people who had a lot of different interests, a lot of different incentives. They all interacted very differently with each other. And people that we get the result that we did. And I think it's important to look at what, instead of, oh, this is the good guy and this is the bad guy, why are these different people acting the way that they are?
Well, yeah, and I think it's, you look at some of the political debates that are happening at the moment, and I mean, a big reason why I'm so passionate about grey history, and I really want to focus on the ambiguities of the past is to move away from this binary good versus bad attitude that we are increasingly seeing as we talk about history. And don't get me wrong, there are certain events and certain individuals in history where it's like, yeah, you just so firmly belong in the bad corner, it's not funny. And I'm sure there's obvious examples that come to mind that fit that. But you look at some of the discussions that are happening around, say, Winston Churchill's a great example of some of the quite binary discussions that you're increasingly starting to see around his past. And it's like, the guy is not, a saint that walks on water by any means, but he's also not the epitome of evil. And I think increasingly we're seeing a range of topics and discussions and events, morph into this quite binary, good, bad, yes, no, and it really irritates me. And I also just think that we've got tremendous challenges, upon us at the moment. The increasing division and factionalism that we're seeing in the West is quite worrisome. And I think we need to do a better job of learning the lessons from the past, because I mean, there's no point us repeating them if we can just learn them. And two, just doing a better job of listening to someone else and not listening to reply, but listening to understand. And I do think that history can be used as a medium to show that well-meaning, well-intentioned, well-educated people can come to a particular problem and have a different perspective and not be, good versus bad, smart versus dumb, these binary labels that we're increasingly seeing today.
Even what we're talking about with this whole time period, you take someone like Pius IX, who under his papacy, to give the end in the beginning, the secular power of the papacy is going to be 100% gone by the end of his papal reign. But on the opposite side, the religious power of the papacy is going to be supreme. And there's a lot you can say that Pius was really bad guy, and there's a lot to say that he was a decent guy, but that's really not the best way to understand him, or really, I think, any person. I think you have to try and understand, why are they doing things? They're not necessarily doing things to just be, 100 years from now, they're going to put me under the good guy column in the history book. They have a ton of different reasons why they do things and why they don't do things. And that's what we should really try to understand, because if we understand why somebody's doing something, maybe we can have a better understanding of them. And in the modern or in our day-to-day life context, you can come to maybe some more reasonable accommodations with people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's really, the guiding philosophy, I suppose, of grey history, is trying to spend the time to get into the detail of the past and have a look at the complexities. And I really do believe that history nowadays is too often oversimplified, and people are trying to give you the one message that adheres to generally the political argument that they're trying to make at the time. And I just do think that everyone could benefit from spending time to look at our shared collective ancestry. But yeah, and what about yourself? What's for my listeners that maybe have only just hearing about or just discovering the history of the papacy, what are you focused on at the moment, and where are you going next?
Well, this episode is going to be in a part of a probably my biggest series that I've ever done to this date on the papacy in the 19th century. And up to this point, I've done almost exclusively really early church history. And if people take an opportunity to listen to my podcast, there's really a lot of foundational papacy in the early and late antiquity, the early Middle Ages. And then I also do a lot of series where I discuss the historicity and the historical nature of the Bible. And I have several peak collaborators that I work with on that. So you'll get a lot of that. But this series is a real departure because I ended with a series with a person who I mentioned in the episodes, Pope Zachary in the 750s, where really his papacy, whether he knew it or not, was going to start a 1200-year long era of the papacy, that the popes had this secular power inside of the papal states and trying to have religious power over all of Christendom, which will change over time. But that really ends at the end of the 19th century, after the US Civil War. We're really into the modern era. And the papacy is really, in that 1200 years, is really, that's a one section of the papacy, is that 1200 years of where they're really trying to struggle being secular power and a religious power. And that's what I really want to explore in this series, is what happened with that. So I'm branching into more modern history, which is definitely not something that I've done a lot with, but I'm really fascinated by it now, this real change in an organization that, I mean, how many organizations in history are there that have a continuity of nearly 2,000 years?
Yeah, not many.
No.
No, it's a fascinating topic. I think church, it's I've spent a little bit of time getting into early church history recently, and it's just so fascinating. And I don't know. I mean, everyone has their own interest, but I quite like the theological debates that you get as well at various times. And I mean, I admit that there's a point in time where it becomes too theological, and it's like, okay, you've lost me. But
Mhm.
when I'm kind of exploring these topics and the like, I just find it fascinating. And then to your point, how the church evolves over time. The split between the Catholic Church and what we would consider now the Orthodox Church in more Eastern Europe. Then again, we studied at high school the Reformation, and so I've always found that particularly interesting as well. And the history of the church, there's just particularly because it insists upon putting itself into such secular discussions and this thing like the Crusades and the like. It's just so fascinating. And then if you want to understand the dynamics at play in modern day Europe, if you really want to understand the Cold War, the modern EU, World War II, then you actually need to come back really to the French Revolution and the early 1800s and the kind of rise of nationalism and the role that the reforms and the role that the church is going through at that point in time are fascinating. So I can see why you're enjoying that period of time.
I want to say I had a great time, and I definitely hope we can do this again. Maybe the listeners out there might suggest a one off where we look at the gray and maybe one event or something.
I think we can lock it in, and we'll just have to figure out what the topic is. But this is, I think, Steve and I are officially requesting idea suggestions. But let's put it in the calendar. Thank you for listening to this special joint episode with Steve Guerra from the History of the Papacy podcast. You can find the History of the Papacy on all good podcast apps, and there's literally more than 100 episodes for you to sink your teeth into. Steve and I had a blast recording this joint episode and would like to do another in the future. So if you have any questions or ideas that relate to either the history of the papacy or the church in France or during the revolutionary era more broadly, please do send them through. We're very keen to do a second round. As always, Grey History would not be running without the support of the community. Joint episodes like this are only possible because I have the time to work on the podcast, and the people making that possible are the Patreon supporters of the show. If you're enjoying Grey History, I really need your help to keep Grey History running. I've left my job, I've moved out of where I was living, I'm doing everything I can to give you more Grey History more often, to give the show a proper shot. But it won't be sustainable without your support. So please, tell people about the show, and please support the show on Patreon. There's now another full-length bonus episode for Patreons of the show, not to mention all the episode extras, behind-the-scenes videos, and other community content. If you're enjoying Grey History, if you agree that history needs to be told in a way that is not black and white, that emphasizes the ambiguity and nuance of the past, then I need your help to keep Grey History on the air. As always, thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day.